Cataclysm. That's the word that springs to mind when these two powerful forces collide, the avoidant and the anxious. Today, dear viewer, I invite you on a journey into the delicate dance between these two distinct attachment styles, why the connection between them so often feels impossible, and what storms brew beneath the surface of their entanglement. Allow me to guide you through this labyrinth of conflicted longings and hidden fears with a touch of wit, reflection, and storytelling. Perhaps together we may glean some wisdom from the tension that binds them. Picture, if you will, a grand ballroom set on a cliffside. The wind howls outside, whipping the sea into a frothy tempest. And here, within the richly paneled walls, stands our cast of two, the avoidant and the anxious. They make a curious pair, do they not? One stands at a distance, aloof yet strangely magnetic, while the other surges forward, heart pounding, arms outstretched in longing. The atmosphere practically crackles with electricity. They inch closer, one longing for reassurance, the other retreating for air, caught in a perpetual game of cat and mouse. This scenario unfolds time and again across countless relationships. The avoidant withholds for fear of losing autonomy, while the anxious escalates in an attempt to close the gap. From the outside, it can appear as though they are reenacting some ancient drama, compelled by forces neither fully understands. The storm outside the ballroom rages on, symbolic of the internal chaos each experiences. But oh, how tantalizing it is. That swirl of tension. Both sides sense the possibility of connection, like a shimmering horizon just out of reach. Let me share a little anecdote, one from my own trove of experiences. I had a dear friend, a gentleman of dignified bearing, who seemed to carry solitude like an overstuffed suitcase. Let's call him Edward. Edward personified the avoidant to a T. He cherished his quiet domain, a small flat where each shelf was meticulously dusted and each picture hung at a precise angle. No chaos was permitted to invade his bastion of independence. He thrived on it, or so it seemed. Edward once embarked on a courtship with a woman named Sophia, who possessed an enchantingly open heart yet wrestled with the pangs of anxious attachment. Sophia, you see, was determined to break through Edward's fortress walls. She arrived with gifts of homemade pastries. She phoned him often to check on his well-being. She penned heartfelt letters brimming with emotive language. In response, Edward grew ever more silent, gradually turning into a ghost who manifested only fleetingly to assure Sophia that all was well, although, clearly, all was not well. Their relationship quickly became a battleground. The more Sophia reached out for closeness, the more Edward recoiled, and the more he withdrew, the more Sophia frantically tried to reel him back. Observing this from the sidelines, I recognized the classic pattern. The anxious partner's persistent pursuit, the avoidant partner's flight. It was a veritable waltz in that cliffside ballroom, each partner stepping to a dissonant rhythm that the other found maddening. Now, to understand why these two styles clash so spectacularly, we must delve into the roots of their formation, childhood experiences. Let us, for a moment, conjure the image of the young child. His or her earliest bonds with caregivers shape the internal blueprint for how love and safety are perceived. The anxious child. This little one might have grown up with inconsistent emotional availability, sometimes coddled, sometimes ignored. Out of such unpredictability sprouts a yearning to hold on, to cling, to ensure the caregiver never drifts too far away. As an adult, this child might become the anxious lover, easily triggered by signs of distancing or unavailability, the avoidant child. This youngster likely developed in an environment where autonomy was either forced upon them or where their bids for closeness were often unmet. Consequently, the child learns to rely on himself, to avoid deep vulnerability for fear of rejection or criticism. As an adult, stepping into the wide world of relationships, this individual might prefer to keep emotional intimacy at arm's length, valuing self-sufficiency above all else. Thus, by the time they reach adulthood, each style is well entrenched. The anxious person yearns for validation and closeness, sometimes to an extent that feels overwhelming to others. The avoidant person has grown accustomed to safeguarding personal space and emotional boundaries. When threatened, they retreat further into the fortress. When these two meet, it is akin to flint meeting steel. Sparks are inevitable. We come now to the central conundrum. Why does the meeting of these two styles so frequently lead to heartbreak, confusion, and the gnawing sense that the connection is impossible? Let us dissect the mismatch. Conflicting core needs. The anxious partner's core need is reassurance. Stay close. Tell me you love me. Show me you won't abandon me. The avoidant partner's core need, on the other hand, is autonomy. Respect my space. Do not suffocate me. Let me breathe. Put these two needs in the same crucible, and you can practically hear the metal groaning under pressure. One party demands intimacy, the other craves distance. Escalation of insecurities. In an anxious avoidant dynamic, each partner's insecurities tend to get amplified rather than soothed. The anxious partner perceives the avoidant's distancing as a sign of inevitable desertion, thus intensifying anxiety. Meanwhile, the avoidant perceives the anxious partner's attempts at closeness as intrusions, causing them to fortify the walls even further. It's a tragic symmetry indeed. Communication breakdowns. The anxious partner may resort to protest behaviors, texting repeatedly, making dramatic ultimatums, or displaying jealousy to gain attention. The avoidant, in response, either tunes out or vanishes, leading to more fear on the anxious side. This cyclical communication pattern drains both parties, leaving them feeling as though they speak entirely different languages. The seduction of familiar pain. Oddly enough, the anxious avoidant dance can be strangely addictive. Each partner finds an echo of their childhood attachment experiences in the other. It is painful, yes, but also compellingly familiar. The anxious person might unconsciously think, if I can make this elusive individual love me, I will heal old wounds. Meanwhile, the avoidant might think, if I remain distant enough, I'll never be hurt as I was before. And so, the dance continues, both parties feeling locked in an endless waltz. I am reminded of a certain holiday getaway I once took with two acquaintances. Let us call them Paul, the avoidant, and Fiona, the anxious. We decided to escape the city's clamor and head to a tranquil lakeside cabin. Oh, how naive we were, imagining restful days by the water. Shortly after our arrival, Fiona became fixated on planning every detail: the morning swim, the midday hike, the sunset picnic, the evening storytelling by the fire. Paul, being the avoidant spirit, recoiled at the thought of such structured closeness. I'd rather do my own thing, he said. He set off alone on daily walks around the lake, sometimes not returning until well past nightfall. This absence unsettled Fiona terribly. Was he in danger? Why did he prefer his own company to hers? She bombarded him with texts, voicemails, knocking incessantly on his cabin door. Paul responded with stoic silence, fueling Fiona's insecurities. The result: a tension so thick you could have carved it with the dinner knife at our table. Fiona's anxious desire for togetherness clashed with Paul's desire for solitude, turning what should have been a serene getaway into a psychological battleground. Indeed, I remember sitting on the deck one evening, listening to the loons cry across the lake and thinking, this is precisely the microcosm of the avoidant-anxious conundrum. That trip ended earlier than planned, with Fiona in tears and Paul quietly vanishing before dawn. The unresolved tension remained like a specter in the cabin's empty rooms. If we could listen in on the internal monologues of these two individuals, we might glean further insight. Let us briefly attempt such an eavesdropping. The anxious partner's thoughts. Why won't they respond? Did I do something wrong? Do they not care about me as much as I care about them? I need to hear from them soon, or my nerves will explode. Maybe I should text again. No, that might push them away. But maybe not texting is worse. I need to do something. I can't bear this silence. The avoidant partner's thoughts. All this intensity is draining. It feels like I can't breathe. I'd rather be alone than deal with this incessant need for attention. Why do they keep pushing? If I give in to their demands, I'll lose myself. I need to step away. I need time to think. I'm not ready to face that conversation just yet. Notice how each style stands guard over its most prized resource. For the anxious, it is emotional connection. For the avoidant, it is personal space. They each fear losing this resource and so become locked in an endless cycle, each seeking to protect themselves from the terrifying possibility of loss. Now you might be wondering, dear viewer, is there any hope for these two wandering souls? Or are they doomed to remain in perpetual conflict? The truth is more complex than a simple yes or no. While the anxious-avoidant dynamic can indeed be turbulent, growth and compromise are possible, provided both sides develop awareness, empathy, and a willingness to adapt. Let us explore some avenues. Self-awareness. It begins here. Each partner must come to recognize their own attachment style, their triggers, and the patterns they bring to relationships. The anxious individual must learn that their sense of self-worth need not hinge on another's constant reassurance. The avoidant individual must realize that intimacy is not inherently a trap or an invasion, but can be a shared oasis of warmth. Clear communication. Both parties must learn to articulate needs in a manner that does not provoke the other's defenses. The anxious can express, "I feel worried and insecure," when communication is minimal. "I'm not accusing you. I just need a bit more regular contact to feel safe." The avoidant can voice, "I need time to process my thoughts. I'm not abandoning you. I just function better with some alone time each day." Such clarifications can work wonders, creating a sense of safety. Imagine a middle ground, a safe, neutral space in that cliffside ballroom where each can step onto the dance floor with respectful distance and mutual intention. Regular check-ins, agreed-upon boundaries for personal space, and consistent emotional reassurance can form the bedrock of compromise. The anxious is thus soothed by predictability, and the avoidant is reassured they won't be smothered. Professional guidance. Sometimes the best solution is to enlist a skilled therapist. Think of it as hiring a dance instructor to help both parties find a new rhythm. Through guided conversations, each partner can unearth childhood wounds that fuel their attachment style and learn healthier ways to connect. The journey may be challenging, but oh, the rewards that beckon on the horizon. One might ask, if the anxious person perpetually perceives distance as danger, and the avoidant perpetually perceives closeness as smothering, is the union fated to fail? The word impossible can appear a bit dramatic, though understandable. In truth, many anxious-avoidant pairings do, indeed, unravel under the strain. Yet I've also witnessed couplings that endure and even flourish, precisely because both individuals developed awareness and practical strategies to honor each other's needs. That said, it is not a mild undertaking. It requires deliberate effort and introspection, confronting the ghosts of the past, addressing the raw nerve of fear, and forging new habits of mind and heart. The question is whether both parties possess the desire and the capacity for such personal transformation. Sometimes the answer is yes, and a most remarkable metamorphosis takes place. Other times the answer is no, and each partner finds a measure of peace by stepping away. To illustrate a glimmer of hope, let me recount a more heartening tale. I once knew a couple. Let's call them Marianne, anxious, and James, avoidant. In the early stages of their union, they swung wildly between tearful confrontations and stone-cold retreats. Indeed, it seemed as though they could never find common ground. Marianne felt abandoned when James spent long stretches of time absorbed in solitary pursuits. James felt bombarded by Marianne's need for constant validation. But rather than give up, they made a courageous choice to face their demons together. They attended counseling sessions, read books on attachment theory, and practiced open communication at home. Marianne discovered that her unrelenting fear of abandonment traced back to a turbulent childhood in which her mother frequently threatened to leave whenever conflicts arose. James realized that his father's stoic, dismissive style had conditioned him to avoid emotional expression as a sign of weakness. Bit by bit, they found ways to soothe each other's vulnerabilities. Marianne learned to tolerate James's need for alone time by shifting some of her emotional energy towards self-care, friends, and creative hobbies. James, in turn, began offering small but meaningful gestures of reassurance, sending a thoughtful text midday, planning a surprise date night once in a while. Over time, the defensive walls diminished, and genuine intimacy began to blossom. Today, they remain together, forging a bond that, while not free of conflict, stands on a foundation of mutual empathy. We mustn't forget that tension, while uncomfortable, can also be a catalyst for growth. Why, without friction, how else might we sharpen our edges and become more refined versions of ourselves? The anxious partner can learn the value of self-reliance, discovering that they are enough, that they need not chase validation relentlessly. The avoidant partner can learn the sweetness of intimacy, recognizing that sharing one's inner world with another can be a profound gift rather than a threat. Perhaps that is the hidden blessing of the anxious-avoidant dynamic. If both parties are willing, the tension can birth a new awareness of patterns that have haunted them for years. It can serve as a clarion call to heal old wounds, to step beyond ingrained habits of fear, and to forge a healthier template for love. This is the paradox at the heart of the impossible connection. Within its impossibility lies the seed of transformation, should we care to nurture it. Now let us distill some pragmatic advice. Regulate your emotions first. If you identify as anxious, pause before sending that fifth text in a row. Breathe, ground yourself, remind yourself that silence does not always equate with abandonment. If you identify as avoidant, pause before vanishing into your fortress. A single reassuring statement, "I just need a little space, but I'm not going anywhere," might soothe your partner's anxiety more than you realize. Set realistic expectations. Understand that transformation does not happen overnight. Old patterns linger, and mistakes will be made on both sides. Expecting immediate perfection will only breed more frustration. Practice the art of apology. When tensions flare and one partner feels criticized or neglected, a heartfelt apology can soften rigid stances. The anxious might say, "I'm sorry I flooded you with messages. I was scared." The avoidant might say, "I'm sorry I pulled away. I was overwhelmed." Such simple acknowledgements foster connection. Celebrate small victories. If an anxious partner refrains from over-pursuing just once, or the avoidant partner initiates communication unexpectedly, take note and celebrate these shifts. They are milestones of progress, stepping stones along a path that can eventually lead to genuine harmony. Returning to our grand metaphor, think once more of that cliffside ballroom. The storm outside still rages, yes, but the music continues inside. With practice, these two dancers, the anxious and the avoidant, might just learn a new choreography. The anxious one, gradually discovering the peace that resides within themselves, learns to move with grace rather than frantic leaps. The avoidant one, recognizing that closeness needn't be suffocating, steps forward with intention rather than recoiling. Their steps become more measured, their gazes meet without flinching, and for a fleeting moment, the tension transforms into art, a ballet of contrasts. Will they stumble? Of course. But in the stumbling, in the catching of each other's arms to prevent a fall, they begin to forge trust. And from that trust emerges a possibility that the outside world calls impossible. In the hush between musical notes, they might discover that they are, in fact, two souls capable of complementing each other, if only they muster the courage to see beyond their fears. So, dear friends, we have arrived at the crux of the matter: avoidant versus anxious. Why the connection feels impossible? The short answer is that they trigger each other's deepest insecurities, each threatening what the other holds most dear. Yet in that fiery crucible, the potential for profound growth glows like an ember. It is not easy, and many a relationship has been dashed against those treacherous rocks. But the impossible can sometimes be made possible when illuminated by self-awareness, empathy, and the willingness to transform. As you turn this knowledge over in your mind, I encourage you to reflect on the ways these attachment styles might manifest in your own life. Perhaps you are the anxious one, forever scanning the horizon for signs of abandonment. Or perhaps you are the avoidant, carefully preserving your fortress of solitude. Recognize that, in each stance, there is an unspoken need, a fear, a longing for love and security. If you can see that need in yourself and in the other, you have taken the first step toward bridging the chasm. And so I leave you with this thought. Though the cliffside may be battered by wind and rain, and though the dance floor may at times feel perilous, the human heart remains capable of remarkable feats. If the anxious and avoidant can unearth compassion for themselves and each other, they may yet find a waltz that resonates with shared understanding, a waltz that defies the label of impossible and instead ascends to something wholly new. Thank you for listening, my friends. May this exploration guide you toward greater insight, whether you stand in the anxious corner, the avoidant corner, or somewhere in between. And remember, no matter how tempestuous the storm, there is always hope for calmer skies ahead, provided we dare to look beyond our own fear and into the gaze of the one across from us on that ballroom floor.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.